Disclaimer, this video was made before any balance patches. I think a lot of these items will probably be reworked, but this has not happened at the time of writing. Also, thank you to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. Number 10, Luminous Shot. Using the secondary skill, charges the next primary attack, dealing 150% damage per charge up to 5 times. This item is the definition of meh. On paper it sounds okay, but in practice it has so many issues. So first of all, there's a hidden bonus 10% experience if you kill an enemy with the charged primary, which I don't even know why they put that in, because if you know anything about how level ups work in the game, you would know that this really doesn't do much. Even if you are getting this bonus on every single enemy you kill, it's not going to equal a full level by the end of the run. Your level of soft caps at a certain point. Even if it was double or triple XP, it wouldn't make a difference. The charge primary itself could be good, but it's really not. Calling it a charge shot in the first place is a little misleading because it's an entirely separate instance of damage. It doesn't charge the shot, it shoots out an additional projectile. It would be like if you called Shuriken a charge shot. Except unlike Shuriken, this doesn't really interact with much. It can't benefit from crowbar or bands, and it doesn't have a proc coefficient, which is insane in its own right. As far as I can tell, every single projectile in the game has a proc coefficient, except this one. Future disputed here, so it turns out that Luminous Shot does indeed have a 1.0 proc coefficient. However, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this isn't the case because for some reason, the game doesn't actually call for the on-hit proc procedure. This means while it technically has a proc coefficient, it still can't activate a few things like ATGs, Bleed, Stickies, Ukes, Polylutes, Plasma Shrimp, Charge Perforator, Molten Perforator, Leeching Seed, Behemoth, Sentient Meat Hook, Knockback Fin, and Shatter Spleen. So, you know, just a few items. As far as I'm aware, the only thing this works with is the armor strip effect from Symbiotic Scorpion and Shattering Justice. That's literally it. I thought I was done with this video, but here I am at 2 AM learning about the most insane oversights imaginable. So yeah, I hope that clears things up a little bit. Stacking it is pitiful. It only adds 25% more damage a stack and gives 1 extra max charge. The only 2 survivors that seem like they could really take advantage of this are Railgunner and False Sun. Railgunner seems like a no-brainer, right? You scope in with your secondary and shoot with your primary constantly. But no, instead of using the damage from your giga-powerful sniper, it instead only works with the SMG. It's still not horrible on Railgunner because you do use your secondary a lot, and it's basically just free damage, but it definitely could be a lot better. On False Sun, you use your secondaries a lot, and you can charge your primary for a gigaton of damage, except, wouldn't you know it, this item is bugged on False Sun, and sometimes it's only 1/3 as effective as it's supposed to be. So that's nice. Interesting item on paper, but just doesn't really work with anything in practice. Today's video is sponsored by Rocket Money. You know what I hate? When companies make it difficult to cancel subscriptions. I recently tried to unsubscribe from a popular food delivery app, and when I went in to cancel, the button just wasn't there. So I call up customer support, and I start talking to an AI for about half an hour that isn't understanding a word I'm saying, until I finally get a person on the phone. This actually happened, and I wish I knew about today's sponsor, Rocket Money, back then. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you lower bills and manage your money better. I've been using it the past couple days, and I genuinely love it. I've already canceled 2 subscriptions to Paramount Plus and Spotify that I didn't even realize I was paying for. They make it super easy, and they've got all kinds of tools for budgeting and managing your credit. I am horribly disorganized with my finances. I have no idea what I'm doing, but Rocket Money makes it so much easier to actually get it under control. It says here, simply by uploading a photo of your bill and tapping a few buttons, Rocket Money can negotiate your bills for you, from internet service to cable and phone bills. What? That's awesome. I didn't even realize that was a thing you could do. Rocket Money has saved customers over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. Take control of your finances today. Go to rocketmoney.com/disputedorigin to get a free trial. You got nothing to lose, and it helps support the channel. Very cool sponsor. Now back to the video. Number 9, Prayer Beads. Grows in power by absorbing experience, storing 20% of player stats per item level up. On removal, gain all stored stats. Ah yes, the proverbial stats. Very descriptive and clear. To be honest, I still don't fully understand how it works. It's like it was designed to be the most confusing item of all time. There's a whole manifesto on the wiki about it that honestly just makes it more confusing, but I'm gonna try my best to explain it. It gets a little messy, so bear with me. Essentially, when you level up, the game increases 3 stats: maximum health, health regeneration, and base damage. When you have prayer beads in your inventory, you'll see a little bead buff above your health bar, and as you gain experience, you'll start to gain stacks of this bead buff. Each stack of the buff is worth 20% of a level up, so theoretically, if you have 5 stacks of this buff, it's equivalent to a free level up. Each additional stack of this item stores 5% more of a level for each buff. So 2 stacks of this item is 25% of a level up per buff, 3 stacks is 30, and so on. Now, you don't actually get that benefit until you remove the item from your inventory via scrappers, printers, phase 4, etc. At least that's how it's supposed to work. But surprise, this item is bugged and it's about to get even more confusing. The formula for stat payouts is this: 20% plus 5% times the number of stacks you have minus 1. So if you had 1 stack, it would be 20% plus 5% times 0. 5% times 0 is just 0, so we're left with 20%, which is correct for a single stack. However, due to a bug, the game only checks how many stacks of the item you have after it's been removed from your inventory. So the correct formula for 1 stack is 20% plus 5% times -1, which is simplified to 20% minus 5%, or just 15%. So this means you would need 7 stacks of the buff to equal a level up instead of 5. But it gets even worse. Because of the game only checking the amount of stacks you have after it's already been removed from your inventory, this means scrappers will completely cripple stat payouts. Scrappers remove items in sets of 10, so if you have less than 11 prayer beads in your inventory, the game will still read it as 0 stacks of the item when you scrap. Other methods of item removal can get around this somewhat, using soups or printers, but that requires gambling, and is probably not worth it. Scrapping is the primary way of getting rid of items, and it sucks it does not work in the way it's supposed to. On paper, this effect isn't horrible, even with it being 15% instead of 20, and I have to give it a little bit of credit. The idea of having to get rid of an item in order to get the effect is unique, but it clearly was not executed very well. I really hate this item. It's so needlessly confusing. They could have just made it so that level ups give 20% more stats or something. It would essentially be the same effect, but instead they decided to give this item its own weird level up mechanic that's tied to XP but separate from player level. Additionally, we already have Beads of Fealty. Did we really need another bead item that's essentially the exact same design? It just feels a little uninspired from a design standpoint. Far from the worst item in the DLC, but it's definitely the most confusing. Prayer bead printers are really good and can make you really strong if you farm a stage for a while. Realistically, I would probably switch this with Luminous Shot and put it at number 10, but I didn't want to instantly ass blast you guys with equations at the start of the video, so it's at number 9. At number 8, Growth Nectar, while benefiting from 5+ unique buffs, gain 20% bonus stats for 5 seconds. Ah yes, our good friend Stats is back again. And for this item, the so-called stats are completely different than the stats you get from prayer beads, so at least it's consistently inconsistent. The stats in question this time are health, health regeneration, movement speed, damage, attack speed, and crit chance. Is it really too much to ask to have that mentioned in the logbook somewhere? I don't think so, but no, we got stats, baby. Whatever. This item is basically a reverse death mark. Instead of needing 4 debuffs to weaken an enemy, you need 5 buffs to enhance yourself. Death mark is a notoriously hard item to activate in single player because there are a lot more ways to buff yourself as opposed to debuffing an enemy. I think anyway. I'm still kind of unclear on what actually counts as a buff. There's a few that make sense, like Tesla Coil, Warhorn, and War Banner, but do bands count as a buff? Shuriken? Desperado? I assume they do, but I just don't know, to be honest. As a red item, it's a little bit underwhelming. I've never actually gotten this item to activate. By the time I get to Mithrix, I usually don't have 5 buffs, but maybe I'm just getting unlucky. To me, this is one of the more redeemable items in the DLC. I don't think it's great, but it at least gets you to think more about your build and changes your decision-making process, which is cool. Most of the new items in the DLC don't do that, so it definitely gets some points from me there. Again, I wish the logbook was more descriptive, but overall, it's not nearly as bad as some of the remaining items on the list. Number 7, Warped Echo. On damage taken, 50% of the damage is dealt immediately, while the other 50% is delayed for 3 seconds. This effect has a cooldown of 10 seconds. Holy, it's a description that actually tells you what the item does? That's unprecedented, and honestly a little upsetting. As far as the new white items go, this is probably my favorite. It's the only one that actually has interesting synergies. As the description suggests, this item splits 1 instance of damage into 2 separate instances. This has a pretty cool effect with Medkit, which activates on a 2-second timer, where the damage delay on Warped Echo is 3 seconds. This essentially gives you double the value. The same is also true for Repulsion Armor and Razor Wire. Tougher Times becomes more useful as well. If it blocks the first hit, Warped Echo won't activate. If it doesn't block the first hit, it has another chance on the second hit. I would have liked to keep this item off the list, but unfortunately this item has a pretty big bug. Who would have guessed? No, I'm not talking about the fact that this item made Mithrix invincible on launch. While it was incredibly frustrating, that has been fixed. What hasn't been fixed is its interaction with Eclipse 8. Warped Echo does not reduce permadamage on activation. You still take the full amount of per stacks, but when the damage split happens, you end up taking even more permadamage. This item makes you take 50% more permanent damage, which is pretty pathetic for an item that's supposed to reduce the amount of damage you take. As somebody that pretty much exclusively plays Eclipse 8, this is super disappointing. I'm actually worse off for picking this item up, which is something that should never happen. 3 out of 4 items I've talked about so far have had pretty significant bugs, which is not a great record. Hopefully this gets fixed soon. Until then, I will never pick this item up. At number 6, Antler Shield, 50% chance on being hit to reflect 10% damage back to the attacker. Each stack increases proc chance by 5% and damage by 10%. This item is essentially just Razor Wire, but 100 times worse. And Razor Wire itself is pretty middle of the road, so yeah, it's not great. One stack, on average, deals 5% of damage taken back to the enemy, which is just painful. Enemies in Risk of Rain 2 have way more health than you do. To put it in perspective, even with 11 stacks of this item, it doesn't kill a Wisp on stage 1. On stage 1. I cannot even put into words how bad this item is. It really doesn't do much more than tickling the enemy. Even with high stacks of it, there's pretty much no situation where this item is remotely useful. I also just fundamentally dislike this item from a game design standpoint. I don't like when the game incentivizes you to take damage. It's a little backwards to me. I feel like the game should be rewarding you for not getting hit, right? It's a problem I have with a lot of the items in the DLC. To be fair, there were a few items in the game prior to the DLC that share this philosophy, namely Razor Wire and Roll of Pennies, but at least those items can interact with the game in interesting ways. Razor Wire doesn't require you to get hit by an enemy, it just requires you to take damage. This opens up builds with Hellfire Tincture, Self-Damage Rex, and most recently, Seeker Soldier. Roll of Pennies is a little less excusable, but it can interface with Crowdfunder builds and Repulsion Armor. Since the amount of money earned isn't directly tied to damage, smart players can farm hits from smaller enemies like Wisps. Antler Shield, on the other hand, is directly tied to the amount of damage you take from enemies, and there's really nothing that synergizes with it. Straight up useless item. At number 5, Knockback Fin, 7.5% chance on hit to knock enemies into the air. Stacking this item increases both the proc chance and amount of knockback. Speaking of items that are an active detriment to your run, like Warped Echo, Knockback Fin is another item that's arguably more useful left on the ground. There really is not much of a good reason you want to knock enemies into the air. The best way to dodge enemies in the game is by getting into the air. Items like Headset and Hopi Feather are amazing because enemies really struggle targeting you. But this works the other way around as well. If you're fighting an Elder Lemurian and it suddenly jumps 20 feet in the air, this not only stops your targeting, making you have to re-aim, but it's also extremely dangerous because if it's in the middle of an attack, it suddenly becomes much harder to read. There is no reason you should ever knock up an Elder Lemurian. Trust me on this one. This item just makes enemies more unpredictable and there's nothing you get out of it. I have no idea what they were thinking with this item. I can see this item being really useful if it knocked enemies backwards instead of up. It would give you the ability to cheese enemies off cliffs and wouldn't be much of a detriment at all. I have to say though, there is one redeeming thing about this item and that's stacking. High stacks of this item, and I'm talking a lot, 10 plus can actually be okay. This is the point where enemies start taking fall damage, and I will admit it's pretty satisfying to see these guys take off. And if you get enough stacks, you can even start launching them into the kill barrier at the top of the map. This takes about 50 stacks though, sometimes more depending on the map. You're pretty much always better off scrapping it and investing those items elsewhere, but at least it has some application, and that's the most positive thing I can say about it. The fact that this item is only number 5 speaks volumes about the second half of this list. Moving on to the top 4, I think any of the next 4 are contenders for the worst item in the expansion, but the least bad of them, at number 4, Noxious Thorn. 25% chance on being hit to inflict enemies with 2 stacks of bleed. If enemies are already inflicted with 1 or more stackable debuffs, add 1 to those debuffs instead. Imagine if Antler Shield was 10 times worse. Yeah, Antler Shield, an item that already set the bar extremely low, and yet somehow this item has managed to outdo it. It's honestly impressive. This item is extremely bugged. The whole part about it stacking debuffs on enemies just doesn't happen. All this item does is apply 1 bleed stack to an enemy for half a second when you get hit, and it only has a 1 in 4 chance at that. That's it. Stacking this item doesn't do anything, doesn't increase proc chance, doesn't increase bleed stacks, even though it's supposed to, and it certainly does not add to already existing debuffs. 100 stacks of this item works exactly the same as 1 stack. Even if it did work like it was supposed to, this item would still be awful. Bleed is only powerful because it can stack infinitely, and getting new stacks of it refreshes the duration. 1 stack of it, though, does not go very far, especially considering it requires you to get hit. And when I say get hit, that's what I mean. This isn't like Razor Wire, where you can activate it with stuff like Hellfire Tincture and Sojourn. Like Antler Shield, you actually have to take damage from an enemy, which again, I just fundamentally disagree with from a design standpoint. I have no idea why they felt the need to add in all these shitty Razor Wire knockoffs. Did we really need 2 items like this in the expansion? They make Razor Wire look amazing, and it's not even that crazy of an item. I don't know, this item just feels like it was AI generated. It seems really out of touch with the game's mechanics. At number 3, Unstable Transmitter. When reaching below 25% health, the survivor explodes, dealing 350% damage to nearby enemies and teleporting to a random location. This effect has a cooldown of 2 minutes. This is an item that feels like it was made 20 minutes before the DLC dropped. It probably was. Everything about it is bad. I usually skip over the logbooks in these videos because they're unrelated to the item's effect, but I have to talk about this one. It's literally 2 lines. You touch it. No way. You touch it. That's it. That's the entire logbook. That's all they could think of for an item that teleports you? Come on. This item's anchor point isn't even centered. That's why it floats weirdly in multi-shops and soups. Surely it floats above the other items because the effect is just that transcendent and powerful, right? Well, no, this item is dog shit, and is again arguably better left on the ground. First of all, the damage from this item is basically nothing. 350% isn't even enough to proc bans. It also has a 2-minute cooldown, which is crazy for a passive item. That cooldown is longer than most equipment, but the teleportation effect itself is by far the worst part of the item. When you get to low health, this item teleports you to a random nearby spot. On top of being incredibly disorienting, it can actually deal fall damage and kill you. Some people have had it teleport them into Void Siege, which, you know, if you're at 25% HP, that's probably the worst place you could possibly be. It can also teleport you right into a horde of enemies. Every time I've had this item activate, it's either killed me or put me in a worse position than I was before. This item is worse stealth kit. Worse stealth kit. Stealth kit. Already one of the worst items in the game, and somehow it makes it look good. I'm all for bad items. I think they're necessary. The bad items are what make it exciting when you find a good one, and it's important for balance. But I don't think we should have items that actively make your run worse, unless it's a lunar. I don't understand why this item wasn't just an equipment. We already have a 2-minute cooldown on it, and being able to control when you teleport would be a lot less disorienting. We also only have 1 equipment in the expansion, and it works passively. Seems kind of backwards. It wouldn't be great as an equipment, but it would be better than what we got. I just don't get it. The further we go in the list, the angrier I'm getting. Speaking of anger, at number 2, War Bonds. Probably the most infamous item in this expansion, yields 75 gold based on the current difficulty level and the survivor's level at the start of every stage. Except no, this isn't exactly how it works. This item actually only gives you 50 gold at the start of a stage, plus an additional 1.5 gold multiplied by your level. This essentially means you have to be at level 17 before you get the advertised effect. Why they did it this way is one of the strangest decisions in the entire expansion to me. This is just so needlessly obtuse, and it feels like they're screwing with us, because the way it's stated in the description is a lot simpler and seems like it would be much easier to program. They really went out of their way here to make this item work differently than you would expect it to. It also works significantly worse than the effect in the description, only giving you 2/3 of the value for most of the game. Did they think it was too OP and needed a nerf? I just genuinely cannot wrap my head around this. It feels like a joke. This item is a contender for worst red in the game. I still think it's slightly better than Aegis because at least you get some value out of it, and I can see it being somewhat helpful in speedruns. When it works, that is. Sometimes this item just doesn't give you anything. Compare this to Gore's Tome, a green item that gives you 3 or 4 times the value per stage, and that's being conservative. I even think a Roll of Pennies, a white item, will give you more value than War Bonds, which is very ageist. I did a community poll a few weeks ago asking what the worst new item was. The majority of you guys said War Bonds, and while this item is hot garbage, there is another item in the expansion that's even worse in my opinion. At the number 1 spot, we have Long-Standing Solitude. On level up, gain a free unlock for the next purchase, but all gold is converted to experience. Anything that costs gold is increased by 100%. So, first of all, this item's effect just doesn't make any sense. It takes away your ability to make money, but then makes everything cost twice as much. Why? What's even the point of doing that? Chest prices are irrelevant once you pick this item up. You literally cannot collect gold, so why make chests cost more? My best guess is they did this to balance it for multiplayer, but in reality, I think this is mainly just a way you control your friends. When you pick this item up, they receive the negative effect instead of you, which is a little absurd. Well, that's not exactly true. This item is extremely detrimental to your run. While 1 item per level might not sound bad, if you know anything about how leveling works in the game, you can see why that's a bad idea. Leveling in Risk of Rain 2 works logarithmically. It's based off this function. Without getting into the weeds too much, it's essentially saying each level up requires significantly more XP than the last. So, to put it in perspective, to get to level 10, you need 1,840 XP. Not too bad. To get to level 20, you need 150,000 XP. Pretty big jump, right? To get to level 30, you need 12 million XP. This is usually where it soft caps. Most of my runs, I'm somewhere between level 20 and 30. But if you loop, you can keep going. You'll need 960 million XP to get to level 40, and you'll need 77 billion XP to get to level 50. See the problem? Even if we take into account the extra XP you'll be getting from converting all your gold into experience, it's not going to take you very far. Even if it doubled your XP, you'd be capping out around the same point anyway. This is really only going to give you 2 or 3 extra levels a run, and that's assuming you get it on stage 1. If you get it later or decide to loop, it's going to be even less effective. Not to mention, leveling is a pretty irrelevant mechanic in the game anyway. Your level doesn't matter half as much as items do. The only stats leveling increases is max health, health regeneration, and base damage, all of which you can get from items and more. When you pick up this item, you're missing out on 2/3 of the loot each stage, and I think that's being generous, especially in the later stages. There's just no situation where I think this item is remotely useful. It could be interesting in multiplayer, but the fact it makes everything cost double just screws over your teammates heavily. In terms of bad items, I really didn't think anything would ever be able to top Stoneflex Pauldron, but this one definitely gives it a run for its money. Obviously, like I said in the intro, this video was done before balance changes. By the time this is out, they may have already changed some stuff. If that's the case, I will make a follow-up video to see how the rankings have changed, so subscribe if you want to see that. Hopefully I can be a little more positive in that video. This video was very negative, but that's just kind of the nature of the topic. There are definitely things to like about the DLC. The stages are fantastic, False Sun is a really cool boss, and even though the new survivors weren't executed as well as I would have liked, they definitely have a lot of interesting ideas. Many parts of the DLC are divisive, but I think most of you guys can agree with me that the items were by far the weakest part of it. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. No hate towards the devs. It's very clear this expansion was rushed, and I think they probably did the best with what they had. So far, they've been very receptive to the community and fixed most of the major bugs very quickly, so I want to give them credit for that, even though I am very critical of this DLC and a lot of the decisions that were made. Kami is probably mad at me for making this one so long, so I'm going to end it here. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. You guys rock, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Ta-ta for now.